Hello, everyone. How you doing today? Welcome back to another episode of the Mob Archaeologist. I'm here with my co-host Rick. Unfortunately, Tony and Eric cannot make it. However, tonight we got Frank and we got James. Last names Fiordilino and Buccellato. Those names go way back into the history of Castellammare. How's everyone doing today?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, doing well. And Rick, you're outnumbered here. 3 Castellammaresi. You better be careful.
That's right.
Yeah, for starters, we were going to go into basically a brief history, the 19th century, and then we're going to go into the 20th century where Frank and James can discuss that more. In the 1860s, there was an interesting event after the unification. And James, would you like to go in and explain that to us?
Yes, thank you. So this was known as a revolt or an uprising against the Cutraras in Castellammare. And it's pretty interesting because I think the scholarship indicates that to understand the emergence of the modern mafia in Castellammare, we really have to go back to this time and this atmosphere, the sort of political and social and economic context here. And what happened was the Republican government under the unification of Italy is trying to get established in Castellammare, but there's a lot of resentment and hostility by the local population. And what's interesting to me, well, a lot of it is interesting, but the government was being, I think, pressured from both ends of the ideological spectrum. There were monarchists and royalists who wanted to go back to the Kingdom of Naples. But you also had, for lack of a better term, on the left side, radical Republicans. And when we say Republican, of course, we're not talking about contemporary American partisanship. We're talking about the idea of those who were supporting a republic in Italy. And the radical Republicans, you had some socialists, you had some anarchists, you had some people who were early adopters, if you will, of Marx. And they were upset about conscription. They were upset about taxation without representation. They were upset about the lack of land reform. And so they felt that the new regime betrayed these Republican ideals. And there's some evidence that the other side was flaming that discontent for their own purposes, which had nothing to do with ending conscription or land reform. So it was very complicated, and it's very challenging to kind of disentangle the different factions. But eventually things boil over, for lack of a better term, and there is an actual insurrection and there is violence, and the protesters turn on the local government, and some people are killed, and eventually Palermo has to send in some troops and put down the insurrection. And that's the basic.
Jimmy, when did this insurrection take place?
1862.
1862.
However, James, you mentioned the Kutara. Could you go into that for us, for people who do not know what that is? That was the local governments, the group that seized control after the revolution, and they ended up having a hold on economics, on land, on the law, and that led to the uprising. On the other side, you had the pro-Bourbons.
Yes, I agree. And again, it gets challenging to disentangle because in some ways the Kutara get kind of lumped into this overall liberal category, but it's actually much more complicated than that, because in some cases there were what we think of as traditional liberals of the time, which they're advocating, markets, private property, democratic elections. But then you have the more radical Republicans who want to go way further than that, right? And have egalitarian land reform, an end to conscription, things like that. These were the socialists, the anarchists. So in some ways they're on the same side, but in other ways they have some real differences. And sometimes those differences would get violent. Meanwhile, you have the other side, which were the pro-Bourbon side, the monarchists, the loyalists. So, and then there's factions on their side too. There were more moderates on the pro-Bourbon side who were open-minded about Sicilian independence and having some land reform. And then you had like the old school reactionaries that wanted to just keep it the way it used to be. So it gets really complicated. In fact, a lot of the so-called liberals were actually members of the nobility. They supported unification. I don't think because they were true believers in classical liberalism. I think they supported it because they sensed an opportunity. These were some of the lower ranked nobles, if you will, that if you stuck to the old traditional ways of the Kingdom of Naples, they were never going to ascend through the social hierarchy. But through unification, they were able to commodify a lot of the communal land. And they became like the kind of new landowners. So the so-called Kutaras are a real blend, a real mix of some true believers, some reformers, but then some others that were more opportunistic. And the mafia is the middle of all of this. And as you can imagine, they're very opportunistic about picking their sides.
Now, do names like Garibaldi and Mazzini come into play?
Not so much in Castellammare. The biggest national name would be Pasquale Calvi, who was Castellammaresi. He was from Castellammare, and he was one of the primary lieutenants fighting for Garibaldi and the Italian unification. And he was kind of interesting because in some ways he is the bridge between the more traditional liberal reformers and the radical Republicans. I wouldn't say he was a radical, but he had street cred with the more militant kind of left-wing types. And some of the reformers, I think, felt that he was a little bit too extreme. So he was an important figure from Castellammare, and he was, I would say, kind of the bridge between the more moderate liberals and the radical Republicans. But he's the biggest name that I've come across.
I'm going to put up a list of the names we have for the Kutara and the Pro-Bourbons. However, one name that really strikes out in the Kutara was Bartolomeo Asaro. I guess I'm going to ask, are there any connections between this guy and the modern ones who are in Brooklyn?
Yeah, I knew a Bartolomeo Asaro. In that case, would probably be I'm guessing, a grandkid being on that and that because he was probably born in the 30s. But they weren't connected. They weren't mob connected. They were a regular family, but everybody knew somebody. That as far as that Asaro, Bartolomeo, that's the only one that I know of.
Yeah, I don't.
But he
I
could
don't
have been
know for
named
sure.
after his ancestor.
Yeah, no, yeah, of course. Doesn't mean not everybody follows. We were talking about that with James. Not everybody follows their family's path. He has a cousin, the Professor Buccellato. In fact, he's got mom on both sides, mom and dad. Mom was a Remy, dad was a Buccellato, died in that war, and he turned out to go to school and became a professor. And pretty much what I hear, he strays away from that life.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Frank's point, when these families are so large that even if you have 3, 4, 5 major examples of mafia involvement, the vast majority of the relatives have nothing to do with this. But I would just go back to Asaro. There is some evidence that I think we have to do some more genealogical research here. But we were talking about with Frank, the first names sometimes are just as important in terms of identifying these families. And Bartolomeo, according to my records here, this is from the parish registers of the one of the churches in Castellammare. He's the son of Girolamo. Then Girolamo is the son of Bartolomeo. So their father's son named after each other. And we know that one of the things we wanted to talk about later was a case study from the early 1900s that also involves Girolamo Asaro. And so I think there's a chance that there is a relationship between these political ones we're talking about and the mafia ones that we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Obviously, it could be a coincidence, but I suspect my intuition tells me it's probably not a coincidence that we're seeing the same first and last names here.
Right.
Frank, you had mentioned about people from the mountains and people from the town. Where would you place the Asaros in this?
There was two sides of Asaros, but the ones to my knowledge from the back, they were also mountain people. They weren't the fishermen.
Two things. One, I have a picture of Garibaldi and Castellammare. I'll put that up.
That'd be cool.
A second question I have is, do the Asaros of Brooklyn, do they care how far back their family goes and that they may have played a part in the revolution? Or is it just, okay, yeah, that's great.
I know like 3 sets of Asaros, probably all related, but then again, split in a lot of other ways. Like there's the Asaro, Vinny Asaro, mob captain, president. I don't like to talk about people that are active or his dad's name was Jerry, and Girolamo is basically Jerry in Italian. So who knows if that's a relative right there? Because like James said, usually first names and last names connect for a while. That tradition's getting lost. Nobody names their kids after their dads and their moms no more. So that's a time. But back then, if you didn't do it, it was bad news.
There's some interesting names that come up, and some names I think will be very familiar to us and your listeners, but some other names that we're less familiar with. And so some of the names that people might find familiar that were mentioned as part of the Kutaras, obviously Asaro, but there was also a Playa, Giuseppe Playa, which is a name that's significant later on in Castellammare. Calandra, believe it or not, which I don't know if Jimmy Calandra, I've never talked to him. I didn't know.
I see the spelling. I think it's with an I. His is with an IA.
Oh, it is. Oh, I never noticed. Okay, Calandria.
Yeah, no, I noticed that, and I was pretty curious myself.
Okay, that's a good call. Good call noticing that.
Yeah, but since I got you real quick, what was the social climate in that time? And since you're talking about Marxism is apparent, anarchy, what's going on, and why are these people actually together? They hate each other today. You'll never see somebody, a right winger and a leftist together. What was going on? It was just the formation of the mob.
Well, they both agreed at this point that they were upset with the so-called liberal regime, the Kutaras. And from the radical Republican perspective, what they're upset about is there was this promise of reform if we have the unification and an independent Sicily. And it doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is this emerging bourgeoisie, they commodify what used to be communal lands. I guess a better way to put it, not communal, was feudal. The feudal lands, which even though they were technically owned by the aristocracy, the peasants had certain communal rights to that land in terms of farming, hunting, access to irrigation and water. And once it becomes commodified and it's what we think of as private property, the peasants are basically kicked off the land, or they can pay, or they can sublet, they can pay rent. And in order to enforce this new regime, they want to have a police force and things like that, which means they're raising taxes. So now the peasants resent that. They've been kicked off the land. They got to pay higher taxes. And then on top of it, they're being conscripted into the military. So they're really resentful that, like, you know, there's the old saying from Orwell, right? Meet the new boss, just like the old boss. So they thought by overthrowing the kingdom of Naples that they were going to be in a much better position socially, economically, and it turned out that that wasn't true. So they're blaming the so-called Kutara, the so-called liberals, who basically those families were able to gobble up the choice real estate. And I've got some data here in terms of like what was at stake, you know, what kind of land we're talking about here. Olive groves, vineyards, and land for cattle and horses and things like that. And the Kutaras really, they gobbled up most of that choice real estate. And so then that means they're also the political powers, the local political powers, and you have some other things going on where they're monopolizing access to fresh water, which the peasants need for, you know, for their agriculture. So there's a lot of discontent on the part of the peasants and the so-called radical Republicans. And the other side, the reactionaries, are quite happy to exploit that for their own political purposes, which has nothing to do with land reform or more equitable taxation. They basically just want to be back in power. They were kicked out and they want to be back in power.
Now, the Kutara, they were originally mostly agricultural laborers, right? The Bracciali. And then after the revolution, they set themselves up to dominate money lending, cattle raising, land rental, combining legal activities with illegal practices such as cattle rustling. It also says that marriage with a woman of a higher social class helped them rise in society. One of them would be elected as a town councilor and was regarded as a, quote, friend of the mafia, quote, but never convicted.
Yeah, that was really important in terms of like social mobility, was marrying into a more prestigious family. But yeah, a lot of these guys start off as people that manage the estates for the nobility. And remember, you have a lot of absentee landlords. So the families that were managing the estates are in a perfect position to privatize that land once Italy is unified. So again, the reason why I keep on saying so-called liberals is because they did support the unification and they did support some of these democratic reforms. But I think they did it because it was in their economic interest to do so, not necessarily because they were true believers reading John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. I think it was in their economic interest to break with the monarchy. So they took advantage of that. But you need people on the ground to support a revolt. And the people on the ground, it doesn't take long before they're pretty pissed off that once they realize the cynicism of the Kutaras, that they're really just interested in becoming the new bosses, just like the old bosses. And something you point out here, the social dynamics, is because you don't have an organized central police force, and because, as Frank has pointed out, if you've ever been to Castellammare, there's a lot of hills, a lot of mountains. Not every place is accessible, especially back then in terms of roads. So it's very easy for people to smuggle things, to hide, to evade police detection. And under those circumstances, a lot of these families who are owning land now, rival families steal their cattle, steal their horses, set fire to their vineyards, arson to get back at people, steal their mules, we know in the case of the later Asaro, they talk about my great-great-grandfather stealing other families' dogs. And
in the 1890s, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1890s. And so what happens is the families start to create their own type of paramilitary, that's probably too extreme, but their own enforcement wings to protect their land. I think you're getting closer now to what we think of as the mafia. These guys were enforcers who could protect the land from rival families. At some point, they agreed to merge into one organization, the Borgata in Castellammare. So I would say two things to that. One, I don't know exactly when that happens, but B, even though that does happen, we know that the feuds between those families, they don't end just because those families have agreed to become part of one organization, if you will. Yeah. Some of those factions and vendettas and things still go on between the families, even though there is somewhat of a unification among those different kind of enforcement wings. And in some cases, they recruit bandits to these groups. And you have a real mix. The mafia was a real mix of social classes, not only in Castellammare, but in Palermo and other places, where you have some upper class guys, you have the emerging middle class, you have some bandits, ex-cons. And it's a real interesting blend of social classes.
It really mirrors the Freemasonry in multiple ways. And I think that has to do with the fact that Sicily was under control of Britain from 1807 until 1815 or 16. And after that, a lot of Sicilians wanted a British constitution, whereas most of the mainlanders in Nobili or Calabria, they wanted more of a French constitution.
Yeah, there's definitely those influences. We know that this kind of mafia that is emerging at this time is very much influenced by Freemasonry in terms of the idea of having a secret society, a secret brotherhood, the rituals. And we know that a lot of the revolutionaries were also influenced by Freemasonry, as you point out. How do they find each other? Well, for the most part, it's through the prison system. They're arresting revolutionaries for treason. And they're in the same prisons as the bandits and the thieves, and they start to compare notes. Yeah. They start to compare notes, and eventually you get this kind of mutation into what we think of as the mafia.
Favignana, I think, played a big part back in the 19th century. One thing about the British, though, is British really influenced Sicily and even Italy to an extent. When we think of the Italian family dinner, you got this nice wide spread, you got wine, you got pasta, fish, all this beautiful stuff. And then you see like the image on the tomato can, and it's got that old rustic look. Majority Sicilians could not afford to live and eat like that.
Yeah.
You either had one thing or you had the other. But that cultural tradition was imported by the British in the 1850s.
Really?
Yeah, very influential. Yeah, I agree. Some other things I want to point out, and we know from this research that before 1865, the authorities were still referring to the mafia in Castellammare as the Camorra. And 1865 is the first point where they start actually calling it mafia instead of Camorra. So it goes back pretty far.
Yeah, because mafia only became in use from the infamous play in 1863.
Right.
The word didn't even exist in a criminal sense.
Yeah, so I think they were using the term Camorra, not because they were Camorra, but I don't think the media and the politicians had any other vocabulary to describe what they were observing.
Right. It was basically a synonym for a criminal organization.
Right. So some of the families that are mentioned here as the early members of the mafia in Castellammare, some you will recognize. There's the Buccellato family. Giuseppe Buccellato is mentioned as one of the first leaders, and that would be my great uncle. And he was Joe Buccellato from Brooklyn. That was his grandfather.
Wow.
And then there were some other people mentioned later in the court documents. We'll get to that, but I'm sticking with the 1860s for now. Some of the other families here are I'm less familiar with, and I think it's interesting that they're mentioned here because we all know Asaro, we all know Buccellato, but Buffa is a name that comes up as an early mafia family in Castellammare. Frank, is that a name you ever heard back then?
Yeah, there was Buffas back in Bushwick for sure. They were from Bushwick.
They were from Castellammare?
Yeah.
Okay. A big name, probably the biggest name at this point, at least according to the people who are researching this, politicians and media, is the Fiorentini family.
Fiorentini.
And that's well, how do you pronounce it? I'm sorry, Frank.
Fiorentini. Yeah. They've been around for a while. But as the years gone by, they became, they got out of that life. I had one of my uncle's best friends was Fiorentini. He owned a bar in I don't know. I doubt he's still alive. Back in Castellammare del Golfo.
Okay, so that is a name you recognize, not necessarily mafia, but it is a name from that area that you recognize.
Well, you said it was a big name. I always I know the name. It's a common name.
One of the Cutaras was a Giacchino Fiorentini. He was born 1887, died 1885. He was described as not only Cutara, but a, quote, friend of all.
Yeah, these guys were dying in 1885. I can trace my grandfather to be born around that time. My dad's died around the 1880s. So these guys were definitely ahead of their time.
Yeah. The Fiorentini family, and I think the emerging mafia at this time, that's I think an important point, Angelo, is how they were able to mutate, because they were the only power that was able to bring stability to this situation. And they had no ideological axe to grind. Whoever was willing to play ball with them, they were like, okay, we will help you restore order. Is it the Cutaras? Is it the monarchists? I don't think they were as open-minded about working with the radical Republicans, because they certainly didn't want land reform. But the more moderate Cutaras or the monarchists, there's evidence that they were shifting in real time, shifting their support in real time based on conditions on the ground. And they were really the ones that were able to restore order in this.
I noticed in looking at one of the lists that there were some names, some surnames in common on both lists, that they were on both sides, and I think we can see something similar more recently in the 1940s with Frank Garofalo apparently supporting the fascists, as opposed to John Tartamella supported the more liberal cause, the Allies. And this was during the time of World War II. So
yeah, that was a beef that Joe Bonanno talks about. One represented the communist Tresca, was that correct? And the other one represented
Carlo Tresca.
And the other one represented Mussolini, and they were trying to figure out which one were the lesser of the two evils. And Bonanno talks about that in his book. That's a pretty good story within itself. It's just I attribute that to being the Castellammarese nature, to whatever climate's going on. That's who we're with at the time. I mean, even though the Mussolini era was a very bad era for most Castellammarese that were in that world, they still pretended like everything was fine during that time. I mean, they had no choice. It goes with whoever's on top, we follow,
Yeah. Even Vito Genovese, when he was in exile, when he had fled the United States over a murder charge, he worked as a translator under Mussolini's people.
Yeah. That's very true. It just goes to show, it's back to what can you do for me lately, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very pragmatic. I agree. In my research, the mafia is very pragmatic when it comes to these situations. Some other early mafia families I see mentioned in Castellammare, Lombardo. I mean, that's a ubiquitous name, though. Lombardo, I think that's a name pretty much every town in Italy probably has a Lombardo family.
Right. Yeah. I've heard it. Another one I've heard, but that's a very common name. That's like Russo,
Right. Yeah. Those are both. Yeah. Throughout Italy, not just Sicily. Those are common names. And then another one, Barone.
Barone. And I did know one in Boston. Some guy that used to come down That was his last name, but it wasn't a common name
Well,
in the mob inner circle.
what I find interesting is that these are the names we're seeing in the 1860s. And then if we want to fast forward to that court document, that court case that came out was it 1908 or 1909, we see some of the same family names, but not others, right? So like Buffa, Barone, Lombardo, we don't really see Farantelli, we don't really see those names anymore, but you still see Asaro, you still see Buccellato, and you also see some new names like Bonanno. So I think it's interesting that there's this period between 1860 and like the 1880s where some new families are on the scene now that maybe weren't as prominent during this political strife, but within a short period of time are starting to show up in police and court documents. And then some of these other families seem to like fade away. We don't really hear about them too much after this 1860s.
Yeah, I think in a way that the mafia provides some social mobility, the ability to move up and advance yourself that they wouldn't be able to have otherwise. If you prove yourself as a mafioso, you could move up within the organization. And as you move up, you can acquire more property for yourself and your family.
Yeah, and as Angelo pointed out, then you usually intermarry with another prominent family. And then the kids and the kids' kids, in a lot of cases, they don't have to be involved in any kind of organized crime, right?
No, back then it seemed like mob marriages were the way to go. It was just a business deal before it, it wasn't like today or even 50 years ago. But back then, it was just a way of protecting your property, just having your kids inherit that life, whatever it was, and that was a very important thing.
Yeah, it's like we talked about before, where you have these different royal houses, these different dynasties marrying with each other for
And that's how they were looked
wealth,
upon.
increased territory protection.
Yeah, I mean, you have 10 kids and you pick which one of your kids is more able or capable of protecting your properties when you're gone.
Yeah, and you see that. I think that's a good parallel with the aristocracy, that these families intermarried with each other, and it wasn't an accident. And you stabilize things, you enhance your holdings, and I think interesting is there are these moments where between these rival families where they intermarry to try to quell these vendettas, and in some cases it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you want to talk about really complicating things. Now you're married and related to some of the families that you're still, you have other relatives that are killing each other. So I mean, I know that happened with the Buccellatos and the Magadinos. There's examples in my family tree where, and in turn their family tree, where they're marrying each other in an attempt to, bring about some stability, but it took a long time for that to happen, for that bad blood to
be.
Yeah, right.
One of the first instances that I've found where the mafia in Castellammare really comes out would be in the 1883 case of the kidnapping of Duke Calvino. He was a duke who was kidnapped and held in Castellammare. Then there was an investigation on it. And organized crime, the discussion of organized crime back in that day was the question of what was organized crime. If somebody plans to kidnap somebody, isn't that organized? Or what if it's a group of people conspire, that's organized? But this idea of a large criminal organization was still very controversial back in that time. And that came out in a court case. But what also came out was that there was a group in Castellammare. The boss was listed as a Francesco Plescia. He had a second who was Paolo Valenti, aka Naschino. And then they were connected to other towns: Borgo, Pacheco, Monte San Giuliano, Valderice, Macardi, San Vito Lo Capo. Giuseppe Bonanno was also mentioned in conjunction with this. But things come out a little bit more 13 years later in the 1896 Gaetano Costa case. Are you guys familiar with that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I wish Eric...
I'm familiar with the Valente name. They were two brothers that were known for cattle thieving back in the time. I'll tell you what, this was stories related to me. My grandfather, Vincenzo Fiordilino, my dad's dad, while he was in the army back then, they had stolen his livestock. I don't know what in particular was. I'm gonna get sheep. He came back, and then it was rumored that the two Valente brothers had stealing his stuff, and they were killed. And he was always suspected of that, and there wasn't enough evidence, and it just died that way. And that name kind of like died after that. So I'm hearing the Valente. What was that? 1908?
1883.
1883. Probably relatives of theirs, because my Uncle Joe, who was the oldest, was born in 1908, and they had kids young. So I'm thinking this would probably be that Valente was probably before my grandfather, because he was probably born about 1883 and 1888. I don't know. I got to check it out. I'm kind of embarrassed by it because I should check it out. But he must have been born about that time.
And Angelo, who were they identifying as the boss? What was the last name?
Plescia, Plescia.
See that again, that's interesting because that's not a name we see in the 1860s. That doesn't mean they weren't around, but and then that contrasts with the court case you're talking about, which was this attempt by the Italian government to they wanted the United States to extradite. Was it Girolamo? I'm probably mispronouncing.
Yeah,
that.
Girolamo Asaro. That was 13 years later, though, in 1896. So
Right.
there could have been a change, or the information that came out in 1883 could have been wrong because they didn't have any informants.
That's a good That's a good point, because in that case that we're talking about, the murder of Costa, and they're trying to extradite Asaro. In those documents, they talk about the I don't know how you would pronounce this. Maybe Frank can help us. They say that the boss of Castellammare at that point is
Ingalia.
Ingalia. Yeah, that's a name I've never heard of either.
Italia, like Italy.
No,
No,
Ingagali.
correct us.
Ingolia, because it's a silent G, but it's an A at the end. Ingalia.
Yeah.
There you go.
I've never.
I
heard
think
that
we can
name.
also point out that we don't know.
The G's are silent, like lasagna.
We don't know if they're referring to this Plescia as the head of the Brigada or as something equivalent to a capo de Cina. From their perspective, he's just a leader. He's a leader of the criminal organization. But as was pointed out, they don't have anybody in the inside to point out who the actual boss is.
Well, in this 1896 case, they identified the boss as Giuseppe Ingalia, who was 50. His second was his son, Stefano Ingalia, who was 26. Now, some other names, they identified members of this group, which were Girolamo Asaro, Giuseppe Bonanno. He was mentioned in 1883. You had Pietro Rondello. You had Martino Giovanni and Salvatore Buccellato. They were 21, 55, 52. You had a Vincenzo Giallo, a Vito Giallo, and a Vincenzo Milano. They were connected to a few people from Monte San Giuliano, Antonino Taglielli, and Vito Castiglione. This was in the 1890s. And you see a lot of these names who those names are familiar with more modern stuff in the 20th century, and names that you guys are familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, Giuseppe Bonanno, the one mentioned here is Joe Bonanno's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one they're talking about. And so these were identified as not just members, but leaders of. So presumably there's more members. These were mentioned as the leaders of what they refer to, and I'm curious to hear what Frank thinks about this. They were calling the Brigada in Castellammare at this point the Andragna gang.
Now they went from Noblidon to Calabrese. I never heard of that. Enlighten me. I don't know.
I don't know. Andragna. I mean, Angelo and Rick. I mean, I don't see that in Castellammare. It's curious.
Oh, last name.
Andragna.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Andragna. The Calabrese Mafia. I'm talking about the last name Adragna.
That's his surname.
Andragna in Italian, right?
Yeah, very mob influenced, all the way up to the 60s, to my knowledge.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So then that syncs well with this documentation.
Back in Italy, though, not here.
Yeah, I can't get my silent G's for some reason. I'm embarrassed. Mi dispiace.
Didn't remember lasagna.
right. Andragna.
Yeah,
right.
I think there was an Andragna in
I thought you said
in
the
the San Jose family.
transferred
that
from
right?
Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
Andrania.
right, Rick. I've seen that name in other contexts, right? Even in Detroit, but not in Castellammare. So for them to actually call the Brigada the Andrania gang is curious. Which also, by the way, they don't mention any people with that last name. They just call it the Andrania gang, but they don't mention any members with that last name. So I don't know what that means, but presumably it's a larger organization than the 10 people that they identify. But just so your viewers who follow this, so we know Giuseppe Bonanno is Joe Bonanno's uncle. I believe that the Asaro in this court case is I'm not positive, but I believe is a direct descendant of the Asaros who are around today in Brooklyn and in
the ancestor, you mean?
The ancestor, yeah. We also have, so more familiar to me, there are three Buccellatos mentioned: Martino, Giovanni, and Salvatore. Now, if you dig into the document, they also mention Felice Buccellato. So there's really four they mention. Felice Buccellato is Martino's brother, and Felice Buccellato is the one who is Joe Bonanno's baptismal godfather. And their father is Giovanni Buccellato. He's mentioned in this document, as Angelo points out. He's 55 at the time. He is my great uncle. And they also mentioned Salvatore Buccellato, who is Giovanni's brother, who is my great grandfather. Martino is deceased before this court case is documented. And I have the official Buccellato family tree, but it's the information is murky in terms of when he exactly died. But this is conjecture on my part, but I'm going to put it out there and see what you guys think. The time frame, my guess is he does not die from natural causes, and I suspect he's murdered by the Magadino Bonanno Bonventre clan. If you look at this time period, this is around the time that they're killing each other. And obviously, they're part of the same Borgata. They work together sometimes, but they still have this factionalism, which is documented in my book and Joe Bonanno's autobiography, among other places. I can't prove it yet. I'd have to find like the death certificate, or maybe some of the relatives in Sicily know. It's such a long time ago, I doubt it. But my guess is it's not natural causes. I think it's quite possible, based on his activities, who he's related to, and the social atmosphere at the time, that he's probably killed by a rival family.
And this is Martino, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he's the one who killed Gaetano Costa. According to this, I'm guessing if I recall, this was like him, what we would say now is making his bones. He's only 21, and this was him making his bones. So he kills this guy who they believe is a police informant.
I got two questions. One, it said that these guys, these names that we went through, that they were the leaders. We don't know. We can't really fit this into like structure with any degree of accuracy, but that would appear to be a lot of leaders. I would be surprised if the Castellammaresi family was that large. I always had them between maybe 20 to 30. I'd be surprised if it was 45 members. I mean, you guys have more experience with this? Would you guys disagree? Is it larger than I've considered?
There must have been 40 members in the Buccellato family alone.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I'm just guessing, but yeah, definitely larger than 20.
Okay.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you had families. You have families of 5 and 6 where the whole family were men of respect, So we're talking about an intimidating factor. You're talking about a good 100.
Okay.
And yeah, of course. And then if you separate both of them between the two clans, who knows? But you're going a lot of gangsters back then, a lot of mobs or mafia guys, whatever. I mean, I could account for just in my dad's family 3 alone, brothers. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So it's possible then that the Castellammaresi family was in Sicily considerably larger than I always thought, because I always suspected that you had more Castellammaresi members in Brooklyn than you did in Sicily, given that the size. But perhaps I was mistaken.
No.
No, okay, that's good to know.
This was definitely bigger.
Okay.
And then it even got bigger when they merged later on between the Buccellatos and the Remy family.
This is
And
Alcamo?
Alcamo, yeah. But then you get the Rimis, who also one of the sisters is married to Badalamenti, not the Rimi sister, the Vitali sisters. One's married to a Buccellato, one's married to what's his name? I'm drawing a blank. Badalamenti, Gaetano. So you're talking about it's a pretty big family. When it
Now,
becomes the Alcamo Castellammarese family, even bigger.
Yeah, so they compare to the American families then in size.
Well, there's only 4 Bogatas in Trapani, right? So the one thing that differentiates, you got to remember, you go to Palermo, there's different areas, and those different areas, they're smaller. They're not as big as these areas. Alcamo, you know, the whole Trapani. You could have people from other towns and be in the Castellammarese Bogata. You don't have to be necessarily Castellammarese, you know, and vice versa, Alcamo, Castellammarese. So yeah, at one time, definitely more than 20. I would have to say double, maybe triple.
I've never seen the name Bonanno in Castellammare. It doesn't seem to be very popular. But another name I don't see is Stallone. Stallone is Castellammarese. I knew his son Sage.
You know, I had an argument. I had an argument with my cousin on this one. One of my uncle's daughters, who hates the idea that I even come on one of these. I'm not going to mention which daughter it is, but there's 2 Castellammares. There's one in Napoli, near Napoli. It's called Castellammare del Stabio, and then there's Castellammare del Golfo. And I know I've read it on Wikipedia. The certain cousin of mine swears that the Stallone name in Castellammare does exist.
I'm looking at the Hollywood Walk of Fame right
there,
now,
so.
and it says Sylvester Stallone's father was from Castellammare del Golfo.
In
I've seen that,
he made
and
a
I've seen the
film.
Stabio.
He made a film called Avenging Angelo. It had Anthony Quinn in it. And in that film, they go to Castellammare del Golfo. That gives it some weight. Now, Stallone is Stallion. So when you look at Rocky, the Italian Stallion, he put that aspect into the movie. Okay, Stallone has nothing to do with organized crime. We're just clearing that up. But sorry to take us.
Well, yeah, he does. He's in that Oklahoma. What is it?
Tulsa King.
Tulsa
King.
There you go.
Yeah, but
I never watched. I have no desire to watch it either.
I haven't watched either, but I think we brought this up the last time I was on the show, that with all due respect, the Bonanno family was very hospitable to me when I met with them in Tucson researching my book. But I think Joe Bonanno, and Frank and I have talked about this privately too, I think Joe Bonanno greatly overstates the importance of his family in terms of the sort of grandiose scale. I definitely think his uncle was a significant guy. We know that from documentation here. It's not just him saying that, but he gives the impression in that autobiography that the Bonannos are the mafia family in Castellammare, and that they're the shot callers. And I don't believe that that's true.
It's actually his mom. His mom's family is, and his mom is a Baventry. That's what happens. He incorporates his last name to being he steals if you call it stealing, he steals his mother's side's limelight, you know. But another one, back to celebrities, there's that Joey Gallo who played for the Yankees. I think he plays with the Dodgers now. His mom was born in Castellammare del Golfo. So he's half Castellammarese, born in Brooklyn.
And they were filming parts of, was it Ocean's 11 in Castellammare? And
I don't want to get into that.
We don't
I
have to get into
that.
Okay. Yeah, so
got balls.
That was an interesting situation. People can look that up on their own if they want to, what happened there. Yeah,
we'll leave that one alone.
But I agree with Frank. I think the membership was larger. So it's quite possible when they say leaders that they meant I don't know if they were necessarily, captains, but because sometimes I think, to Rick's point earlier, sometimes the vocabulary they're using is just to signify that these are significant people, important people. So they say leaders or bosses, and not necessarily maybe the way we think about it in terms of a chart, an organizational chart, but that these are the heavies. These are like the influential guys. But I agree with Frank. I don't think it's just limited to these 10 or 12 guys they mentioned. I think the Borgata was pretty big, and I think it was bigger even compared to other coastal towns. I think that's why Castellammare really stands out. Is when you look at some of the other research, like Rick, who was the guy? Was it Maxwell, the guy who did like the ethnography in Castellammare? Do you remember? Was it Gavin Maxwell? Is that the I cited him.
I think Gavin Maxwell wrote about the bandit Salvatore Giuliano.
Yeah, but he also did. I'm looking at the bibliography in my book, Shameless. So yeah, Gavin Maxwell, the 10 Pains of Death. It was an ethnography. He was an anthropologist, I think, or whatever he was, a writer. But he did an ethnography in Castellammare, and it was really striking to him at how, for lack of a better term, mobbed up Castellammare was for how small it was in terms of geography. So, for Frank, you want to speak to that?
No, that's definitely true. I mean, there's a lot of area, but not that many people. We obviously in the summertime there's more because we get a lot of people come back for our summers are beautiful in Sicily. So, and we're a coastal town, but yeah, that most of the town just, it seemed like everybody was mobbed up. It didn't matter, and if they weren't, they just shut up and mind their business. It just seemed like there was a world that definitely a lot of members. For an example, you got look at all the Castellammarese Banana members you have in America, right? And just imagine if they weren't in America, they'd be back in Italy. So that even doubles the amount, at that time, in the middle of the 20th till the middle of the 20th century, the Castellammarese were pretty dominant in the Banana family.
And I think there's other writers similar to Maxwell who have talked about how outside of Palermo, Castellammare was mafia, if you will, mafia-ish, for lack of a better term,
very.
Of any place outside of Palermo.
That would make a lot of sense. One thing that came out in early statistics was that Castellammare had a, quote, low crime rate, but a higher murder rate than average. They could never account for that. We can now, but
so
back then it was an anomaly.
Right. The mafia leaders didn't tolerate petty thievery and things like that.
And there was an aunt of mine. I don't know if I ever got to the story. My Aunt Serafina, who happens to be my dad's sister, one of my dad's sisters. He had another sister, Anna, and she was married to a Bastiano Pizzo, and they were a family of cattle thieves. And my godfather was his dad, Joe Pizzo. They were known to rob cattle and all that. The whole family fought it. They only left one alive. The one they thought it would never come back at them. They killed all four brothers, the Pizzo brothers. So Joe Pizzo, who becomes a member, he died a couple of years ago. My godfather, my Aunt Serafina's son, somebody had to account for this kid that he won't come back like in The Godfather and take revenge for his dad's death. So all these Pizzo kids had to be adopted by the other mob guys to make sure that didn't happen. So he ended up, they took accountability for him. This is our nephew. We promise nothing's gonna happen. And that's what my dad, his brothers did for him. And I remember my godfather saying, they should have had me killed there because the work they made me do on that farm for the next 20 years. He goes, was unbearable. He was kidding around, but he said he'd rather have died that day.
Yeah, I find it interesting how in some cases they have these vendettas and they kill a lot of members of the family, and then at some point the families reach some kind of detente, and then the next generation they allow to live, as Frank points out, and then they actually thrive. I mean, we saw that with a specific example. Buccellato, his father was Don Felici, who was killed by the Magaddino Bonventre group in 1921. Remember, Joe Bonanno in his autobiography says he was hacked to pieces. He's also mentioned in this court document we've been talking about. Felici's son, Cola Buccellato, his godfather is Giuseppe Magaddino, the very guy who probably killed his own father. And yet Cola Buccellato is allowed to live and thrives and becomes a very important member of the Borgata himself, and coexist with members of the Magaddinos and Bonventres. And that's very interesting to me, how you could decide to put that aside. Like you get to this point where they say, okay, I'm not going to avenge my father, and it's very intriguing to me. And I still don't. I have to admit, I still don't understand how that works. That complex social psychology there.
That happened in Philadelphia with, I want to say, the Narducci's. Correct me if I'm wrong. Scarfo in the 80s had the father killed and the son still ended up joining. I mean, that's a more of a modern example in an American city, but there's examples of that if they put it aside. What we're talking though back in regards to Castellammaresi, vendetta killings and family feuds do play a little bit of a higher factor into things, admittedly.
Yeah, for sure. And so what happens in Castellammare is if my hypothesis is true and Martino Buccellato was killed by the Bonanno Magaddino Bonventre faction, there were other killings. I talk about it in my book. My great grandfather was killed. My great grandfather Salvatore, who's mentioned in those court documents, he died under mysterious circumstances. It's kind of murky in terms of. I mean, my family thinks he was probably killed. It's actually a parallel story to Joe Bonanno's autobiography, where he talks about, if you heard in the Frank will appreciate this. If you heard a story that, oh, so and so relative, they died because they fell off their mule or they fell off their horse, no one ever believed it. They believed, right. Oh yeah, I know what that means. I know what that means. He was killed by.
It's like when somebody in the mob dies. It's always, he must have did something wrong.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So eventually the Bonanno, or it's probably more accurate to say the Magaddino Bonventre clan, they win. They kill more of my relatives, and my relatives are on the run for the most part, except for the younger generation who are allowed to grow up and be part of that world. And then Mussolini comes into power. And then, as Frank has pointed out on other shows with you guys, that after World War II, Mattarella was the person who was able to bridge the divide and bring those warring factions back into a kind of united Borgata. And those families were able to coexist and thrive. But my understanding is that even up until the 1970s, the Buccellatos and the Magaddino Bonventres were still very distinct factions. They weren't killing each other. They coexisted. In some cases, they married each other. But they were still very distinct factions, and that the Buccellatos were always closer to Alcamo, always closer to the Rimi family and Minore family in Trapani, whereas the Magaddinos and Bonventres were more the Castellammaresi, more like intermarried with the other families that were local. So, but it is fascinating to see the same names decade after decade after decade. I think it's fascinating, at least.
Well, getting
back to what you said about Martino Buccellato, that was probably connected to the Good Killer murders.
Yeah, it could have. It would have been. The court documents came out in, I think, 1910, and he's already dead at that point. But yeah, I think it was in all likelihood part of that same feud. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think my family probably killed someone in retaliation for that murder. And then that's when you get the Good Killers emerging as kind of a hit squad in the United States to tie up these loose ends, like get the Buccellatos who are involved. But I would say, in fairness to my family, you killed some of our guys first. So what are they supposed to do, right? They're always pointing the finger at each other, the two families, but like that's how it worked, right? It was tit for tat and retaliation. So I'm not sure either side has the moral high ground.
Yeah, but the Good Killers, they come about, they're in Williamsburg, right? Stefano Magaddino's part of that, the Vito Bonventre as well.
Yeah.
This is, we're going what, in the 20s, right? This is about
1921. 1921.
1921. And this has always been my argument with Joe Bonanno. I think we've discussed this. He's born in 1906. There was supposed to be a ceasefire, a peace treaty, if you will. That's 15 years, and they're still killing each other 15 years after. So much for that theory, no?
Right.
Another piece.
No, yeah, I agree. There may have been a temporary ceasefire, but it didn't last long.
Yeah, I think he said in his book that his father had to return because of problems reoccurring in Castellammare.
Well, and I'm pretty sure everything comes down after the unification, not the unification, but the the United States invading Sicily in 43. It gives it a little bit of a time span. I think by 45, like that, 50, Mozzarella steps in. He causes that truce. I think that's how far that vendetta went.
Yeah, I agree. I think that during World War II, they probably weren't killing each other because there was, to use a cliche, bigger fish to fry.
To get hung. Yeah,
right. They're just trying to survive and outlast Mussolini. So sort of maybe and we know that Francesco Buccellato, who was at that point, records indicate, was probably the last big leader in the clan. He goes to Tunisia after once Mussolini comes into power. He splits.
everybody's leaving. There's the mob begins in 1931. Many exiled Sicilians at that point. But by 1929, from 24 to 29, Cesare Mori, the Perfetto, he just demolishes the mob. And then Mussolini tells him, stop, take your foot off the gas a little bit. And you did enough. There was hardly no mob left in 5 years.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And you guys were talking about earlier, like they can mutate and shift sides. They don't have any ideological predisposition. My understanding is that there were some mafiosi in Castellammare who openly sided with the fascists. And in their case, they were sort of allowed more license to be, in the open about doing things as they used to do. Whereas the families that were on the outs with the fascists, to Frank's point, really had to go underground, either leave Sicily or try to be very inconspicuous and low key.
Yeah, you can't let them join them. And you had to be careful, because there was some Castellamarese at that time were taking thought the fascist regime was gonna last forever, so they kind of got caught with their pants down too after that was over. You had a lot of people that didn't like them, not a lot, but you had a small percentage that thought the fascists coming into Sicily was a good thing, and they probably were assholes for that. How long? 6 years, 17 years, whatever it was, and they ended up getting chased out of Italy. So if you see a lot of Castellamarese names you don't see anymore after World War II, there was either two things: either they were communists or they were fascists.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
either that, or they got shovels on their head.
I can't find my other documentation here, but there was a report, a parliamentary report that came out in the 1960s, and they actually mentioned one of the Castellammarese mafiosi who was openly a fascist. And as soon as World War II is over, they kill him.
Of course they did.
They kill him as soon as the fascists are out of power. So
yeah, I mean,
predictably,
right? Yes, but it's a Castellamarese trait. Going with the sign of the times. They're political people. We jump at a little bit of a faster skip than the normal people.
Yeah, but Mozzarella was obviously an important political name. It still is to this day. And of course, Sergio Mozzarella, his mother, is a Buccellato.
Yeah, she's a Buccellato as well.
So I know my family in Sicily is very proud of that connection to Mozzarella. They view he's the favorite son, the hometown hero, the president, and Persante too. They Persante, they
the one who died in the 80s.
Yeah, they have a lot of reverence for him. They're proud, as you can imagine. But the father is more controversial. Bernardo.
The father, very controversial.
His legacy is more complicated.
But even the son today, the president, he reminds me of a lot of Bobby Kennedy in ways. Bobby Kennedy's dad was a bootlegger and half a crook, got his family into politics, whatever. And then he went after the mob. And same thing with the Mozzarella, the president. After his brother died, he didn't want to hear nothing to do with the organized crime whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that was part of the controversy with Persante was, I think some guys in the mafia had a real problem with the son trying to be a reformer. This is to Frank's analogy of Bobby Kennedy. And the attitude is like, well, wait a minute. Like, you know who your dad was? Like
Your
now you're
dad had Salvatore Giuliano killed.
no, that's right. That's right. So it's like now you're going to be on your high horse after like you're going to try to be morally superior.
Right, he was responsible for the Porta della Ginestra massacre.
I agree. But this is coming out of the we're fast forwarding through time here if that's okay. But this is from the parliamentary report in the 1960s. Before the First World War, the Mafia of Castellammare and that of Montreal were probably the most powerful in Western Sicily. So again, there's this idea, to Frank's point, that the Borgata probably was rather large, is that outside of Palermo, I really believe from the 1860s through like the 1960s, Castellammare was probably one of the most mafia-centric towns outside of the capital.
The evidence supports it. Oh, I'm sorry, Frank. Go ahead.
Well, that's why we had such an influence in the United States. One of the families was made up of people from that town because they had that influence from that time on, and that's what it was. It was a fraternity. I always say it back then. And when we came to the United States, it became the same thing.
Salvatore Maranzano, just real quickly.
Yeah,
He
sure.
was boss of Castellammare, but he was also the provincial boss of Trapani in the 20s, and he was living in Palermo at the time. Because back then, might even be still to this day, is that bosses of certain families in Western Sicily, they opted, or they could in some cases, move to Palermo and still retain their positions. And being in Palermo kind of put them at the epicenter of the mafia's power. It's kind of like senators and moving to DC.
Yeah,
And speaking of Maranzano,
go ahead, Rick.
I think in a 1903 report, it mentions a Maranzano Fondo. So apparently his family was a large landowning family. So that could have had something to do with his ability to move up in the organization.
And his wife was a minore, a member of her family was the big mafia clan in Trapani. So he intermarried with a significant family too. Yeah, I agree with Angelo. I think some of those bosses were some of them were more Cosmo, if you will, but others were provincial though. Others were the opposite. You remember like Godfather Part 2 where he says, nothing could get my brother to leave that 2-mule town. So some of the bosses were the opposite, right? Very provincial. Like, I'm not leaving my mountain villa for anything.
Yeah, I always said it when we used to go back and, there was people we used to see and they'd come down. It was a total cultural shock for me coming from New York City where the gangsters were 3-piece suits, wanted to be in. This guy right out of the mountains, come down, with his clothes, bring his regatta over there to visit us. In our cases, some of them grew up with my brothers, and they haven't seen him since they were kids, and they would come and say hi, or even my father's friends, haven't seen him in a while, and then you hear this guy was who he is, and you're like, wow, that was a shock, you know what I mean? That was different, and you get that. They just, like I said before, where people try so hard to make you think they're a gangster in this country, and that country they try so hard to make you think they're not. Back then, gangsters moving to Palermo and stuff. I always felt that the politicians did that. Mozzarella lived in Palermo.
Good point.
The gangsters, they didn't want that kind of heat. That's the way I seen it. But who knows? But then if you go to Palermo, the Palermo Don gangster is very flamboyant. He wants you to know as well, and I'll tell you, it's different. It's different. It goes from region to region, province to province.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think as a provincial boss, that maybe it was almost required for Maranzano to be in the center of Western Sicily, because he would have to probably take part in meetings with other provincial bosses and other important bosses as well. And I think Nicola Gentili talks about and Joe Bonanno as well, how Giuseppe Morello, who was allegedly Giuseppe Merceria's brains or possibly his underboss, knew each other back in Sicily. That most likely would have been in the early 20s when Giuseppe Morello and a bunch of other American mobsters were fleeing a death sentence on them imposed by Salvatore d'Aquila. So he was very likely one of the important people they came to meet.
When does Maranzano immigrate to the United States?
1925.
Really? Wow. He got the power quick then.
Well, he basically had to start over. He was a soldier, but he retained his respect, and so I think that's why they looked up to him as a leader, and he became the boss so quickly.
And Sciarro wasn't. You guys researched it more than me because he's not Castellammarese, even though he was leader of that faction. He wasn't like a wartime boss. So I think it was Maranzano had the not only the pedigree but the attitude, right, to surpass. Like to Frank's point, it didn't take long for Maranzano to position himself as the as the shot caller.
The fascists take over that, and he's in New York overnight. That was
quick. Well, Sciarro
had
left. He abandoned the family in 1930.
He wasn't a fighter.
There's various reasons for that. Joe Bonanno has his set of reasons, and some FBI files supply some other possibilities, or it could be a combination. In that vacuum, he was the most logical person to become the next boss.
Hero became boss in March of 1912. We know this because informant Salvatore Clemente announced when Di Gaetano stepped down and when Sciarro was appointed. And from that point, from 1912 until 1930, he was boss of, that's a pretty long time. But the guy, he did a lot of traveling. He also ran, I want to say, an import company, a traveling agency. In his absence, there were people that were running things. I don't know if you want to call them acting bosses. I don't feel comfortable doing that without more information. But one thing we can see, though, is under Sciarro's tenure, there was a lot of bosses pumped out that went into other cities. Salvatore Sabella down in Philadelphia, Gasper Messina up in New England, Milazzo in Detroit, Lanza, Magadino in Buffalo, Lanza in San Francisco, and probably others. And what you see, fast forwarding, I don't want to go too far ahead, in a lot of Bonanno family history coming out in the 60s and the 70s, 80s, and even up until the 2000s, is this implementation of panels. You have Capodicine, but then some of these select captains become part of this almost administrative panel. It's very different than the consiglio that we see in Detroit, Chicago, Tampa, Scranton, Kansas City, etc. That was more they were more like shareholders, for lack of a better term. But in the Bonanno family, you had what appeared to have been an informal panel separating the administration from the rank and file. So the boss could actually go and do what he needed to do, and you had this admin panel. Arguably, in the 1920s, one of the guys who was probably on there, aside from Vito Bonventre, might have been a guy named Benny Gallo, who was from Salemi or Santa Nifa. They're right next to each other.
They are. You mentioned the Milazzo from Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
He was also Castellammarese.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
And he was killed, I guess. Yeah, Milazzo's a pretty common name.
Yeah, he was actually killed. He's an interesting guy because he is involved in a lot of these different case studies. So he's involved in the blood feud with the Buccellatos. He's a loyal Magadino Bonventre soldier. And the way I lay it out in my book is the Buccellatos actually try to kill him in Brooklyn, and they're unsuccessful. And in retaliation, they killed my great-grandfather in 1917, the Magadino Bonventres did. But then because Milazzo survives the Magadino Buccellato blood feud, he's on the right faction now because they're the most powerful, not only in Sicily, but in the United States, in Brooklyn, right. And then Detroit. They're the hegemonic Castellammarese faction. They won the war. So he's in a good position. And yeah, he assumes a leadership position in Detroit, but then he gets caught up in the so-called Castellammare War.
Where the Castellammarese War.
The Castellammarese War,
right. He falls victim to that, don't he?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I think some of it was internal Detroit stuff, but it's definitely, you can't detach it from the national scene that's going on, where you have in Chicago, New York, and Detroit, these factions where like Aiello, Milazzo, and Maranzano are aligned, and then Capone, Castellammare, and Masseria are aligned. So I definitely think he gets caught up in that. And but it was also internal too, because Castellammare, he wanted to, be the boss of Detroit, but he was aligned with some of these national figures.
I
No,
got
what's
you.
also interesting about Casper Milazzo is, according to Joe Bonanno and I believe Nicola Gentili, he said that Milazzo was the boss of Detroit, but according to, I believe, maybe your sources and Scott's, that they don't recall him as the boss. Is that true? Maybe you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, in my book, I don't say he was the boss. I think it was,
Catalanate.
yeah, Cockeye Joe's brother, Salvatore Catalanate. Um, because the only person who says that Milazzo was the boss is an outsider, is Joe Bonanno. So, and maybe Gentile too, but they're both outsiders. I've never been able to confirm that within sources, within Detroit, that Milazzo was ever the official boss. There's no doubt from the newspaper reports. I mean, the newspapers definitely identify him as a significant member of the Detroit Mafia. He certainly has status. He lives in a mansion. The neighbors say there's always people coming and going from the house all hours of the night. He was a snappy dresser, apparently. So he's definitely a significant person, but I can't say if he was ever officially the boss at any point.
There was another Milazzo in my town that was pretty powerful guy. Going about the 70s, 60s, probably related. There's not many Milazzos that are not in my town.
Yeah, there was a prominent politician who ended up going to Rome, who was a Milazzo from Castellammare after World War II. So yeah, that's a name that comes up in other instances.
We have enough politicians like Castellammare del Golfo to fill up the Italian Parliament. God.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's why the city is more important than maybe you might think by just looking at the demographics of it.
Yeah, I'm being a smartass, but it's kind of true.
No, it's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys before we wrap up, because I know we're jumping all over the place, but since we've mentioned now these connections between the United States and Sicily, so back to post World War II, we know that in 1957 there's the infamous Mafia summit in Palermo at the hotel, and Luciano is there, Badalamenti is there, Joe Bonanno is there, Galante is there, all these big shots.
Montreal there.
I don't know if he was identified as being there. I don't know.
I thought he was. That might be wrong.
Maybe I don't know if I've ever seen his name listed as there, but
yeah, I don't recall seeing his name either.
No,
or
but
he greeted Bonanno at the airport, one or the other.
He did. He definitely greeted him, like literally rolled out a red carpet for him, which by the way, the State Department in the United States was really pissed off at Mozzarella.
They weren't cahoots. What were they pissed off about?
Yeah, well, that's true. So, but what's less known is Joe Bonanno also held a mini summit in Castellammare after the Palermo summit. So when you read Joe Bonanno's autobiography, he makes it sound like he went back to his hometown just to reminisce and for nostalgia and drop flowers off at his parents' grave at the cemetery. And it's a very sort of pleasant notion that that's why he was there. But he was also there for business. And there was another summit, a mini summit, just of the Castellammarese in '57, and some of the people that were there: Vincenzo Rimi, Gaspar Magadino, Diego Playa, Frank Garofalo, Cola Buccellato, Vito Vitali, Vito Messina. And this is what I want to ask Frank in this parliamentary report. It says they met at the ACI Motel in Castellammare. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what they're talking about. Have you ever heard that? This would be
no. Wait, no. It was 13 years before I was born.
Yeah, ACI. I don't know what that means.
The first time I remember my town was when I was 15. That was 85. I don't remember no ACI anything.
Yeah, my guess is that in 57, it's probably one of the only nicer hotels in Castellammare. Excuse me. 1957 Castellammare is more similar to 1800s Castellammare than we think of now. You know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, they had like 4 cars on the road back then.
Right. That's what I mean. So when if they had this summit with these significant dons, I'm guessing it's probably at that time the only, or one of the, probably the only nicer hotel in the town at that point.
It could still exist under a different name now.
Yeah, probably.
It was one of my brothers. I don't know which one's one born in 59, the other one's 62. But one of their baptisms, Pino de Guano, the one that talked to the Louis Rentavelli, he drove my family from the church to the reception hall in his car, and that was a big thing back then. Like, I think that was like 59. You know what I mean? He had a bigger car than the usual. The people were going there, and he drove everybody there.
Yeah, so I suspect in 57, Palermo's different, but in Castellammare, 57 was probably pretty striking for that town to see all these big shots converging, for this summit. I'm sure everyone in the town knew about it. Yeah. But I just think it's an interesting historical tidbit to throw out there that they didn't just have that summit in Palermo. They had what I'm referring to as kind of a mini summit with just the dons who were Castellammarese, and then from Alcamo. Vincenzo Rimi, whatever's going on in Castellammare, I think Frank will agree with me here. Alcamo always looms large in the background. The Rimi family, even though they're not Castellammarese, they're usually somewhere in the mix.
Well, not only that, they're also Rimi's brother-in-law is Badalamenti, who's he's the guy at that time back in with the up and comer. His boss dies in what year?
I think it was, who was his boss? Was what year? Manzella, I think, was his. I can't remember the first name.
Yeah. And he ended up getting blown up, and then he took over after him. So he was probably the second most powerful man right there in Sicily, Western Sicily.
Yeah, and what's interesting is in the report they say Joe Garofalo, but I'm assuming they mean Francesco. I'm assuming they mean Frank.
It's Frank.
Garofalo.
It's Chicho Garofalo. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why they say Joe. I still.
Yeah, he was always known as Chicho Garofalo.
Yeah, okay. It could be just a mistake from the person providing the information. And I'm assuming he's not listed there, but if you look at the time frame, 57, I'm assuming Giovanni Bonventre was at that meeting too. It's unimaginable to me that he wasn't at that the smaller meeting in Castellammare.
Right.
That makes sense. Do they have any idea of the topics under discussion there? I mean, they usually assume narcotics,
Yeah, I would.
That's usually the big thing.
Yeah, I would think narcotics and that. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't actually. It's a good question. There's not a lot of detail here other than they met. But
I don't know how big the narcotics game was in Castellammare del Golfo 57, where I think it was probably hidden from his American protege, the buddies. I'm talking about Bonanno. When he discussed the drugs, they say he discusses it in Palermo in that meeting. I don't know. When do the Castellammarese actually get involved in that trade? You don't hear much about Castellammarese and drugs until the 80s, and not all, but
Carmine Galante was arrested, I believe, 1960.
I'm talking about the Italian side.
The Italian?
Yeah, Carmine Galante, I'm pretty sure dealt with the Palermo Don.
The only ones I would say that on the Italian side that are mentioned pretty early in police documents in Italy are the Magadinos, Gaspar Magadino and his son, Giuseppe Magadino. Are, in fact, they're actually tried and convicted on drug charges.
Yeah.
And that's why Gaspar he leaves and comes to the United States. He's on the lam to get away from a drug pinch.
I think for a while it's a farce. They're putting out that they're not involved in drugs, and they're giving that to their countrymen back home. That's not their thing. but at the same time, they're dealing with the American counterparts in that. And even though Galante is Castellammarese, he might as well be American, you know. And look at the faction of the Bonanno family he was involved in. They were like straight out of Rikers Island, you know. They were thugs.
Yeah,
Yeah, they were tough. Yep.
that's true. I was just going to mention that, we usually think of Carmine Galante as this ultra traditional Sicilian mafioso, but, when you hear him speak like he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, he sounds as American as anyone else.
I know. And if you watch that documentary I was on, the Narco Wars, this episode 1, season 2, you notice his daughter tries to explain that he tried so hard, he wanted so bad to be from the other side, you know, and I guess she noticed that he wasn't as she got older, but that's what he wanted. And I talk about it all the time, and that's his own people killed him. That's the people he wanted to be like.
I'm thinking about Montreal and the way that the Bonanno family established that Decina out there. It seemed to have incorporated the foundations of the Catronis. Am I right?
Yes.
Catronis. But after that thing was brokered, what happened was you had people from where the Rizzutos are from. I don't remember the name right now. Eraclea something.
Castellammaresi, something like that.
Yeah.
And those guys were the ones that were brought over to be a part of this Bonanno Decina in Montreal. I haven't seen any Castellammaresi brought over. I'm just making that point. I don't know what that means.
In Montreal?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't. But I just don't. I think there's a misconception sometimes that people think that these people were brought over to the States. They were there already. They just didn't want to go to work, and that's what they wanted to be. They had some pedigree back home, and they were told to come around. They weren't picked. Don't believe that. They didn't go back to Castellammare del Golfo and say, "Let's get the pick of the litter and just you're gonna be my new bodyguards." They were there. They were in New York. They were in Montreal. They were all these places. It's a rare occasion that somebody gets to go
sent
back
over. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I agree with Frank.
that, James.
It seems like a more organic process than you would get from some of the literature, which says like Galante goes in 57 and establishes this pipeline where he can recruit people. I think I agree with Frank. It's much more organic than that. I mean, we're talking about their late 1800s, early 1900s. Guys are going back and forth from Castellammare to the United States. I just think it's more organic. I agree with Frank. I think it's just sort of a natural thing that happens, and as opposed to like a recruitment drive.
Well, what happens? I'm sorry.
You get an old head. You get an old head like I'm sorry. You get an old head like James's uncle Joe Buccellato, Giuseppe Buccellato. He knew who's who from back home. He didn't recruit. If he seen them around, you notice it. Like who noticed there's 5 sons in a family. One wants to go to work, one wants to go to school, and the other one wants to hang out in the corner all day. That's the guy who's going to probably get picked up and recruited if his pedigree is good too, because they didn't pick anybody. And there's another thing too they used to see. It's like a caste system. Even in Castellammare del Golfo, there was the families that were a little less fortunate, and they were frowned upon. They were, the people, the octopus salesman or something, and he would drink all the time. That was frowned upon. And then when they would immigrate to the United States, that stayed with them. If they had a sister that was a little loose, that stayed with them too. It goes to show that their family really did practice morals well. And it's just they were at the wrong place. Or actually, I was going to say the right place at the right time to get recruited, but it's actually the wrong place. And if they weren't going to get in trouble in New York, they're going to get in trouble in Castellammare del Golfo or whatever town they came from.
One thing I wanted to say about Montreal real quick is we really don't have any inside informants to reveal what was going on. So what people had were authors who were trying to do a narration from the outside. And as a result, everything the Rizzutos did since the 1960s was some well thought out Machiavellian chess game. And at the end of the book, it talks about, oh, these Rizzutos are so powerful, and
Right.
putting Vito away, that's just taking off a crop of hair that's going to eventually grow over. Well, within a couple of years, we've seen this whole narrative just totally collapse because people were arguing that, oh, it's the sixth family. They don't need the
Right.
Bonanos. They don't care. They're so much more powerful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, it's their organization. And within the confines of the organization, Montreal was still under the Bonanos. I don't care how rich, Vito Rizzuto was. Doesn't matter. But
It's law enforcement. I mean, you could commit a murder, get caught with 10 kilos of coke, and get 12 years in Canada.
mhm.
Here, it's lights out. You ain't gonna see nobody. You know what I mean? The guy who was implicated in the Salmontagna murder, he's got the French name. I forgot.
Desjardins.
Yeah, right. I don't like to talk about active people, but he was convicted of that crime. Am I correct? He's out of jail already.
Can you
He's out
do
of
me a
jail.
favor and repeat that name, Sal's last name, for the audience so we don't have to hear frickin' Montaigne anymore?
Montagna.
Montagna, that's right.
Montaigne. Yeah.
Get it, got it good.
With the G. You the G's, like I said. And the guy's out of jail already. The ink on that and that the print on that news story is still wet.
Yeah.
I remember first reading it too. He was a good kid. God rest his soul. He was a good.
Yeah,
Yeah, some countries have very liberal prison
right.
systems.
Yeah, that's what I was
and
just gonna say.
yeah,
Yeah, Canada is way behind in terms of the US. They're probably, I'd say, where the US was maybe in the 50s. They're starting to realize that, okay, they have an organized crime problem, but the
Yeah.
laws just are not on the books to implement it. That's why you have more Calabrians in Canada than you do in the US, because in the US, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, that's going to come down hard, and you're looking at substantial prison times. Whereas in Canada, people are getting sentences that are 3 times more lenient. So Canada has a lot of catching up to do, but with everything that's happened in the last, Toronto and Montreal, the last 10 years, there's going to be blowback from that.
Well, look at British Columbia and other organized crime groups. You have the triads, you have all different types over there, and these guys are major murders, getting 15 years, 10 years, 20 years. They're just gonna come back, and after 10, they're not going after their money like they do here. It's easier to be a criminal in Canada.
There might have been an early
but you get killed faster too, you know that.
Yeah. There might have been an earlier family in Vancouver that was headed up by Gentile's relatives. Yeah, there was a presence there, but we don't know enough to really, for us to say, oh, well, Vancouver had its own family, 100% confirmed. We can't confirm it. We don't know it. But there were a lot of members there, and there seemed to be some connection between Vancouver and Seattle.
Oh, well, the Calicuccios, they weren't a mob.
No, they weren't.
No. I'm out here in that area, and that they were always brought up as being they own topless bars and vending machines.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gentile's family was from Siciliana in Agrigento.
Who was that?
Nick Gentile and his family. It might have been Vincenzo Gentile that was
Vincenzo, yeah.
out there, and they were from Siciliana.
Washington State, they never had a family there. Seattle had a pretty early Italian colony, very sizable presence, but for whatever reason or not, maybe a lack of Sicilians, there was never an established family there.
You know where you get Sicilians? In Frisco.
Yep.
That's where Joe DiMaggio's from.
There was a rumor that the Genoveses had a captain in Seattle. Don't know. That can't be. This was back in the 60s. Can't be confirmed either way.
Yeah.
So I'm not misrecollecting. Yeah.
I know it's like the Siberia and the witness protection program. When you're ready to get kicked out of somewhere, it's saying to Seattle.
All right. This has been our episode of the Mob Archaeologists. I'd like to thank Frank and James for coming on. A lot was covered, a lot was discussed, and Rick, always thank you for co-hosting, and hopefully we get Tony and Eric on when they're less busy. Real life comes in. But thank you very much, and I wish everyone a good night. Thank you for watching.
Good night,
Take it easy,
everybody.